What's up, everybody? Welcome to another installment of Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, Emmett Penny, your Nuclear Barbarian, and I've got my buddy Noah back here again, because that is right, we are continuing our synth fuels deep dive. Today, we're going to be getting into the world of hydrogen. We touched on this a little bit before, and I think, Noah, correct me if I'm wrong, but we decided to do this one because we've been seeing a lot of stuff about hydrogen. And the thing that sticks out most clearly in my mind is Trudeau or someone in Canada saying that they were going to do some sort of hydrogen process and export it to Europe. And it's kind of clear that that talk is really a stalking horse for like LNG facilities, which the world sorely needs right now. But you and I were like, we could stand to have more clarity on this. So that's where we are. Thanks for coming back. I'm excited to get into this.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here as well and greatly honored, of course.
Okay. So last time we talked about like what hydrogen is, people, you can head back. It's just a couple episodes ago into our discussion there to sort of get some ground under you. But we wanted to talk, or rather, I'm going to pester Noah with questions while he talks to me about how hydrogen is made, because we mostly talked about consumption and transportation last time. So let me ask you, Noah, how the hell do you make this stuff?
Historically and chemically, the first ways we had to make hydrogen exists in the form of reacting an impure metal with an acid that would lead to the metal being oxidized and the hydrogen ions in the acid being reduced and being released as gases. And after that, we got like the first very inefficient hydrolyzers, where you would put water with some sulfuric acid and a little anode and a cathode into glass tubes, and then you would have forming the hydrogen and the oxygen on the anodes and the cathodes, respectively. Those processes didn't give you a lot of hydrogen, especially when you look into incredible amounts of energy you would put in. I remember doing this as an experiment in university, and we actually calculated how efficient this process with those late 18th century electrolyzers were, and we were at 8%. So it's really inefficient. But it's important for chemistry because at the first time, it allowed to produce significant amounts of hydrogen for a lot of chemical experiments. But when really chemical industry needed to take off, what was needed was a process of turning main energy source at the time, coal, into hydrogen. And that was done, and then you can do that essentially with all fossil fuels. You can do that with coal, oil, or natural gas. You can do this. It's called steam reforming. So what you do is that you put the fossil fuels and react them with steam at high temperatures in the 500-degree range, and react them with the steam to release the hydrogen and carbon dioxide. So the efficiency of those processes is around 70%. And of course, they emit carbon dioxide, and you always have less energy in the hydrogen than you would have in the fossil fuels that you were using. But the chemical industry needs hydrogen. Our modern life would not exist without hydrogen to produce ammonia, to produce hydrogenated fatty acids for stuff like margarine, for tons of chemical products, for plastics that we need to be a modern society. So those steam reforming processes for the chemical industry were really important at the beginning of the 20th century. And those steam reforming processes are currently also discussed in making blue hydrogen. This is something that comes up when it's talked about hydrogen. It's this hydrogen rainbow. So we give like every possible way of making hydrogen a different color.
Oh, right, yeah.
So gray is the classical steam reforming, where you just dump all the gray is that where you dump all the carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere, and blue is where you would catch the carbon dioxide from those reactions and then try to store it underground. And of course, doing this would add to the energy cost of it all, and you can't really always capture all of the CO2. So what you have is less efficient, but significantly reduced in greenhouse gas emission hydrogen. So this is the classical process, and the classical process with carbon capture. This is gray and blue hydrogen. What's been existing for a long time, because people, even back in the early 20th century, used electricity, mainly from hydro plants, where hydro electricity was in abundance, especially in Norway, to make hydrogen from renewable electricity. So with hydroelectricity, because hydro is cheap and reliable, this is especially easy. And what people used were alkali electrolyzers. So those used water infused with a lot of compounds to drastically increase the conductivity of the water. This would allow you to decrease. So this is a big problem. When the amount of hydrogen you produce in your electrolyzers is proportional to the amount of current you flow through. Since every hydrogen ion has the same amount of charge, and current is charge per time. So what you would want in your electrolyzers is a lot of current with the least possible amount of voltage. That the theoretical lowest possible voltage is 1.2 volts. So getting this voltage down was what drove the efficiency increases in those electrolyzers. As I talked to you, like the early processes were at around 8%. So those ran at 12, 14, 16 volts. And getting those down to 2 volts, 1.8 volts, 1.6 volts allowed hydrogen made from electricity to be viable, at least where electricity didn't came from coal.
Right. Okay. So let me just ask you, how do you reduce voltage? What was it they did to bring it down? I don't know if that's a silly question.
So the voltage, basically, the way you want to have the same amount of current flowing at a lower voltage, this means you have to reduce the resistors. So you have to increase the conductivity. The way you would do this is essentially increasing the surface area of the anodes and cathodes, using better materials for those anodes and cathodes, and increasing the conductivity of the water that you put in. So putting the alkali metals or previously the sulfuric acid into the water.
Okay, cool. That was helpful. Thank you.
So in those early versions from the mid 18th century, you had small anodes and cathodes long distance apart, and finding ways to putting those anodes and cathodes closer together, increasing their surface area, but still not combining the hydrogen and the oxygen that you create at the same time, because if you combine them, they will react violently. So if you put those cathodes and anodes closer together, it's more hard to separate those gases, and that is what limits this.
Okay, cool. All right, so we've done, what have we done on the radar? We did gray, we've talked about blue. I think we need a few more colors.
Green with hydro.
Green with hydro. Okay, tell me. Yeah, green. Okay, and then what's next? Is there another one?
So you could do the same way that you would do the green with hydro with the alkali electrolyzers, was proposed basically for as long as we had those alkali electrolyzers, is making the green hydrogen, the renewable hydrogen, with wind and solar. But doing so will run into a very important problem early on. And that is what plates wind and solar also when we talk about making grid electricity with wind and solar. And that it's volatile and it has a low capacity factor. So what this will always lead to is the low capacity factor will lead to a low capacity factor of your electrolyzers. And it also will lead to your electrolyzers needing to do a lot of ramping. So many of those electrolyzers can't do that at all. Production following electrolyzers that can essentially do demand response in order to reduce hydrogen production as the sun dies or as windly. Those are more expensive to build, and doing this demand response that the electrolyzer needs to do following the production from the renewable source will also damage it. So this is what drives it. You have more expensive electrolyzers that are getting damaged faster and are producing less. So this is the difference.
That sounds like a bad deal.
It's extremely a bad deal. And all of those electrolyzers will run into resource restraints basically as soon as we will mass industrialize them. This is the same what renewables and batteries are experiencing now. And all those electrolyzers will also be experiencing this in a couple of years or in around a decade if we now start to decide we want to do a lot of green hydrogen from wind and solar. So this is something that I would like to emphasize, what isn't being talked about, even among people who are very critical of renewable, of wind, no, to be precise, of wind and solar energy, is the following. Making hydrogen from wind and solar requires electrolyzers that are a scarce resource in itself to run on low capacity factors and experiencing more wear and tear. This is the thing. Just the electrolyzer part of the making hydrogen process will be 4 to 5 times more expensive when you run it on wind and solar compared to hydro or nuclear. But especially, you will run into those resource constraints. And even worse is when you will do what many people are proposing, using peak wind and solar production to make hydrogen. This is this idea. So we have this incredible amount of wind or solar energy for very short times. For those times, the wind and solar electricity from those plants will be essentially worthless. Why can't we use it for it? So this is their idea. We will use it to make hydrogen to store that electricity. But now you would be taking the capacity factor from the electrolyzer down from 20 or 25% to like 5 or 4%. Those electrolyzers will be barely running ever. And even when they will be running, they will run for a short time, will do incredible load ramps, and then be shut down again.
Highly stressful industrial process.
Incredibly expensive. People who talk about making hydrogen from peak wind and solar are either idiots or they are lying to you. They are idiots or they are crooks. There is nothing in between, because this is so ridiculous, so wasteful with resources and money. It's so diluted that you can disregard any person that talks to you about this bullshit about let's make hydrogen from peak wind and solar production. This is a completely different thing than making hydrogen from wind and solar in general, where we would throw away the overproduction and just trying to use the average amount to get as much capacity factor of the electrolyzers. This will be expensive and wasteful in general, but using peak production for hydrogen is absolutely diluted.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions I have about this. Like, so it seems like no matter what, there's going to be a future for hydrogen. We need it. You know, there are going to be a bunch of different ways to produce it. I think if you're listening to Nuclear Barbarians, you can kind of guess and fill in the details on why nuclear is superior for this in terms of its reliability, its, energy density, et cetera, et cetera. What is it, aside from the crook or dummy factor, that makes these narratives around hydrogen so seductive, do you think?
It's a sense of iconoclasm that is inherent in the hydrogen. It's like combustion of hydrocarbons, but without the carbon. It's like combustion with no CO2 emissions. And it is incomparable essentially with many of the fossil fuel infrastructure. We often talk about like blending hydrogen in with methane, but hydrogen doesn't really dissolve with methane at all. So using hydrogen as a fuel would require complete retooling of our energy infrastructure. In this sense, it's much more similar to like battery electric stuff. That it gives the sense of starting from a clean state using a completely different technology. And what people, especially people that feel guilty for the large amounts of pollution that we are producing in order to survive and thrive, what they see more than a sensible solution, I think, is a more morally pure, or a solution that at least seems more morally pure, and that definitely exists in the hydrogen. And you can start off, or at least trying to start off making hydrogen before you solve like other issues, because you could start off with making the hydrogen from the fossil fuels. And this is also why I think large parts of the fossil fuel industry are in favor of supporting the hydrogen agenda. They can make hydrogen from their fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
And it would not require you to find like sustainable sources of carbon, which you would need for synth fuels. And you would not establish synth fuels that can really displace many of the refined fossil fuels like petrol or diesel. And you would always be handling this hydrogen stuff, which is always a more shittier fuel. So it's less threatening for the fossil fuel industry.
Mm-hmm.
It's more morally pure for the activists.
Mm.
It pleases the people's desire for iconoclasm, and it's generally advantageous for politicians because it helps them to justify their plans with natural gas, which has been falling out of favor over the last couple of years. And we desperately need to revive natural gas, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But selling that right now is a hard pitch. So selling hydrogen is more easy.
Mm. Okay. And that's sort of the Canada example that I brought up at the
Yes.
top. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what do you think is the realistic future for hydrogen? Like, where do you see it going in the next few years?
There is currently a lot of talk of making hydrogen with renewables. If we look at what the and big plans are drawn up, the EU has recently stated that they want to import 10 million tons of hydrogen from outside of Europe and want to make 10 million tons of hydrogen inside of Europe in the next 10 years. So if you would look at how much electricity would we need to make renewable electricity, including overproduction, transportation, liquefaction, to make that amount of hydrogen, we would be talking about, 500 to 600 terawatt hours of electricity for those 10 megatons each. So 1,200 terawatt hours of electricity combined. To put that into a context, last year in the EU, we had, I think, 650 terawatt hours of electricity made from nuclear, which is our largest source of electricity in the EU. In the US, you had like 880 terawatt hours of nuclear, I think, and wind made a little bit more than 300 terawatt hours of electricity in Europe. So what they essentially plan to do is building in less than 10 years the same amount of wind and solar we built in the last 20 years just for hydrogen, and that combined added to the ridiculous amount of electricity from renewables they want to put on the grid to drive electric cars and power heat pumps and replace coal.
Wow.
So even if we ignore the stuff about the electrolyzers, when we look at the plans of how much green hydrogen they want to make, those can't be met. The production, the build out of all that wind and solar capacity can't be done in general, and especially not in Europe, which is currently facing a great labor shortage and will be facing an even more labor shortage as a lot of baby boomers will retire very soon. And there are not enough millennials and Gen Z to follow their footsteps. So we will face a labor shortage of 3 to 4 million people in Germany in the next 10 years.
Wow.
And this is on the same order, same size roughly, that what we need to achieve the build out of all the renewables and of all the wind and solar that our government currently plans to achieve until 2030. So we are horrendously understaffed. We don't have enough labor. We don't have enough resources for those incredibly labor and resource intensive industries that wind and solar are. Those targets won't be met. They are currently hitting their limits to growth, and by that I don't mean their absolute size to which they can grow, but the velocity, but the change at which they will grow. They are hitting their limits to growth. They can't grow faster, and we expect them to grow significantly faster than they actually can, and this will horrifically backfire. especially when we look at the Canada deal, where Germany tries to get 500 kilotons of hydrogen from Canada, especially made through wind electricity. Doing that would mean Canada would need to build, just for this amount of hydrogen it plans to export to Germany, the same amount of wind turbines that it has built in the last 20 years. Just for the export to Germany. And what they stated is they want to see hydrogen flow into Germany starting in 2025. They, of course, don't plan that all of it starts to flow in 2025.
Sure, but some.
Even getting some done, or a significant amount done in 2025, will be hard. But realizing the 500 kilotons in the next 20 years with wind with wind in Canada, I am highly skeptical about. Canada does not have the amount of labor that it would need to build that much wind on top of what the Canadian government already wants to build with wind electricity in their country.
Right. Wow. Yeah. And I mean, there are all so many other factors to add to it too, like the rare metals markets, the general issue with issues with creating steel and stuff right now. You know, we're going to have a lot of nagging issues moving forward for many industrial processes, let alone some of these green goals.
Of course, I think one issue that is the resource issue is currently talked about more than it was in the past. I think this is coming to light pretty well right now. The land use and environmental impact issues of wind and solar have been discussed for quite a while now. What I fear, also the capital issues, that will be incredibly capital intensive, and unlike nuclear, which is also capital intensive, we won't get enough out of it to make that capital investment count. But what I fear isn't discussed enough is the incredible labor intensity of building all those windmills and then also operating them. And this is something where I've seen that especially the renewables now around the wind sector, like overestimate how much labor is needed to run a nuclear plant. And I had a discussion with one of them. It was a German one. So he was proudly talking about how this 2.6 gigawatt offshore wind park that Denmark wants to build will just use 3,000 people. And I was like, yes, but 2.6 gigawatts is the Grafenrheinfeld nuclear power plant in Germany. Not Grafenrheinfeld, Gundremmingen nuclear power plant, which employed 600 people and made like 2.5 times the same amount of energy.
Right, yeah.
So reliably. You have like reliably 5 times less people making more than twice the amount of energy. And this is just to maintain the power plants. And it is the same with building those power plants. A well-run nuclear sector will use 10 times less people to make the same amount of energy compared to the wind sector, and even a terribly run nuclear sector like the one in France, which is incredibly wasteful.
All sorts of issues now. Yeah.
Yes, I recommend listening to the appearance of Mark Nelson on the Decouple podcast.
Yeah.
But I think one issue is that they waste their labor resources. They use too many people to do too little. I think that has several sorts of reasons. But when I look at how much people we need to run those incredibly large German nuclear power plants, which are currently going extinct, compared to how many people the significantly smaller French or American nuclear power plant use, I fear that there's a waste of labor that we can't afford to waste. And renewables, the best renewables are even worse with conserving labor than the best renewables are worse than the worst nuclear in this sense.
Wow. Okay. So what are we leaving out? What haven't we gotten to about hydrogen yet that we think listeners should know?
Red and white hydrogen.
Yeah, so let's do it.
White hydrogen is pretty simple. It's a naturally occurring hydrogen. Yes, hydrogen sometimes occurs naturally as pure hydrogen. It's extremely volatile, so it doesn't do that very often. But sometimes the rock can trap hydrogen, and those hydrogen resources can be extracted. It's interesting but don't get your hopes too high that this will save us. I think there is a project in Sri Lanka right now. Yes, interesting. I think we should explore this. One issue could be hydrogen leakage. As hydrogen can extend the half-life of certain greenhouse gases, but it's completely CO2 free. This is white stuff. It's not that important. What I see as not being talked a lot enough about is turqua and red. So turqua is using methane pyrolysis. This is a process that was first used to turn natural gas into coke. Because some countries could access natural gas, but turning it into high-grade metallurgical coke would increase the value, since metallurgical coal has far more value than the energy stored in it, and it also would give you hydrogen. So the methane pyrolysis, in that sense, would use the hydrogen, burn the hydrogen to get the coke and the energy in the coke. So methane is CH4, 2 moles of hydrogen, 1 mole of carbon. And what this idea is that you get the mole of carbon out there as a pure fuel and burn some of the hydrogen that is released as a waste product, or use the hydrogen as a waste product. What is now being discussed, I fear not enough, is the reversal. Using the methane pyrolysis to turn the methane into hydrogen and coke and storing the coke. One advantage this has over the blue hydrogen made from steam reforming is that this way you still store the carbon rather than releasing it into the atmosphere, but you restore it as solid coke, which doesn't biodegrade, which will remain solid coke until a human digs it up again and burns it. So you can reliably store the carbon. And one thing that I fear far more in the inadequacy of blue hydrogen than we won't be able to capture enough of it at a too high cost is that we won't be able to store it reliably in the ground, and storing the carbon will be much more reliable. The turqua hydrogen is less efficient than the steam reforming process, because in the coke is stored a lot of energy which you would lose, which you would accept losing to store it more safely. Keep in mind that storing the CO2, capturing and storing the CO2 will also be incredibly energy intensive. So I think in generally the blue hydrogen and the turqua hydrogen will be equally efficient. One problem with the turqua methane pyrolysis, it requires to run at significantly higher temperatures than the steam reforming process. We're talking about 900 degrees rather than 500 degrees. So it's hardly possible to drive this process with nuclear. If we see an advance in high temperature reactors, we could possibly drive this process with nuclear process heat. Using nuclear process heat to make the turqua hydrogen will be much more efficient to burning some of the hydrogen to get the hydrogen out. In fact, it's actually the most efficient process of turning nuclear energy into hydrogen is doing this, because for a kilowatt hour of process heat from nuclear you get 5 kilowatt hours of hydrogen, of energy stored in the hydrogen that is released in this process. So if not, you could possibly do this with nuclear electricity, since electricity can be turned into process heat of any degree. And even then, getting like 5 kilowatt hours of hydrogen for a kilowatt hour of electricity is a good deal, because if you would use electrolysis, you would always get less. You have no CO2 emissions, or no direct CO2 emissions, since all the carbon is stored in the coke. But you have some methane leakage. You would also have the methane leakage when using the steam reforming process. All fossil fuels lead to methane leakage. I think the methane leakage is a significantly less worse than the actual CO2 release. Methane does us the favor of decaying on its own. So rather than CO2, which until we actively pull it out of the atmosphere, will
it's
stay
just going to hang out
forever. So, but methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. So I would say it like this: we live under the illusion, or people live under the illusion, not all of us, that we can fix global warming quickly. And because of that we think that even though methane has a short half-life, will decay quickly, it is still important because this global warming can be fixed quickly. So let's don't do this. However, I would say it's more likely that it will take 4 to 5, possibly even decades, possibly even a century to fix global warming.
Yeah.
And in this regard, pulling out more methane, which will decay with a half-life of 12 years, is a significantly better idea than putting out more CO2. So wherever tetrahydrogen could be used, I would advocate for using it.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Last one.
Red, or
Let's
sometimes
do it.
pink.
Okay. So
I think
tell me what this is all about.
There are conflicting ideas
Accounts.
what the color would be. I think the Russians once said it was red and the French once said it was pink, but it's hydrogen made with a nuclear electricity or nuclear energy, to be more specific. I mean, you could potentially do it even without electricity, but the methods involving electricity are more promising. So like hydro has the advantage of being always on. Nuclear has the advantage of being always on. So you will utilize your electrolyzers significantly more efficient. You will use them just as efficient as hydro, potentially even more, because even hydro, especially now that we experience significant climate change, will become less reliable than nuclear. It will become even less reliable than nuclear in the future. Never as little in reliability as wind and solar, but it's worse than nuclear. So nuclear allows you to have higher capacity factors and more reliability. It will put less strain on your electrolyzers. You will use them more efficiently. You will use the resources that you need to put into them more efficiently, the labor that you need to maintain them, and the money that you need to invest into them. So just from the capacity factor and the reliability, making hydrogen from nuclear will cost you roughly around $1 per kilogram for the electrolyzer part, compared to 4, 3, rather 5 for renewables, just for the electrolyzers. So this is really important. What's also important is the evaporation enthalpy of water. And what this means is the energy required to turn a certain amount of water into steam. And this energy required is incredibly large. You use precisely 2/3 of a kilowatt hour to turn a kilogram of water into steam. So doing this, 1/6 of the energy required to turn liquid water into hydrogen is essentially just spent on turning the liquid water into steam. So going from liquid water to gaseous hydrogen, you essentially also go from liquid to gaseous, and you have to spend the evaporation enthalpy of hydrogen. But what's even worse is that most combustion processes don't allow you to recoup that energy loss, because accessing this energy that you put in requires you to condense the water. So compare that in your car. In your car, you would only want the water from your exhaust gas, the steam, to condense after it leaves the pistons. Problem, at this point, you can't use it in your engine anymore. So all internal combustion engine can't use this evaporation enthalpy. External combustion engines can use it, but this would mean that you have to have a heat exchanger in which the exhaust gases are recondensed into water, which adds complexity and cost. So you spend energy on the evaporation enthalpy in making the hydrogen with electricity that you can never get out, or almost never get out. And even when you can, only with great cost. So this is a drawback of cold electrolysis, where you have liquid water and turn it into gaseous hydrogen. Another process would be steam electrolysis. Gaseous water turned into gaseous hydrogen. The benefit of this is the evaporation enthalpy is already overcome. Another enthalpy benefit is, since the steam will be hot, it comes at a higher energy level and will need less electricity to turn the steam into hydrogen than turning the water into hydrogen, regardless of the evaporation enthalpy. But the evaporation enthalpy is a huge deal. And nuclear energy gives you process heat. And it even gives you really hot process. For a steam electrolysis, hot enough process heat. There are ideas of using geothermal energy to make steam for steam hydrolysis, but that would limit the steam temperature to below 180 degrees. So the steam would have very little density. So it would require you to build massive electrolyzers. Nuclear can make steam at close to 300 degrees at least. Hotter reactors even to 500 or potentially in the future maybe 800 degrees. So now you are talking about steam that can still be steam at pressures up to 70 bars. So this gives you an advantage. This steam is more conductive than the lower temperature steam. First, from the increased density, second, from the increased temperature. As I said earlier, in making electrolyzers, you want to have the water as conductive as possible. This gives you an advantage. Right. Another advantage is not that the hotter steam electrolysis over the colder steam electrolysis have, is the electrolyzers can be significantly more compact, which makes them easier to construct. So steam electrolysis in itself gives you an advantage in that it overcomes the evaporation enthalpy with heat and not with more expensive electricity. And the more warmer your steam electrolysis process gets, the more efficient it will become. So light water reactors will power this significantly more efficient and more cost-effective than geothermal. Warmer reactors like the sodium reactors will be even more efficient than the light water reactors could be. And potentially the high temperature gas reactors in degrees between 800 and 900 degrees, they could be incredibly efficient. And potentially even you could use processes like sulfur iodine, which is a pure thermolysis process where nuclear process heat or process heat in general is turned directly into hydrogen. But this process involves using hot sulfuric acid. And by hot, I mean 1000 degrees. So using this process will put a lot of material constraints on whatever device does this process. So I'm not that bullish on sulfur iodine, but I'm more bullish on the steam electrolysis process.
Okay, cool. Wow. Okay, so we have a few avenues to pursue here. It seems clear what's realistic and what isn't. And as ever, it sounds like we need way more nuclear energy.
Of course.
All right.
There's no other way.
Yeah, there's no other way.
I'm sorry. If there would be, I would be advocating for it. But learning more about it essentially just makes one more sad about the way we are going with putting so much of our eggs in this wind and solar basket.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So did we miss anything? Did we leave anything out?
I think one thing that could be mentioned is when we discuss hydrogen over synth fuels. So, I mean, this isn't, we wanted to do podcasts on synth fuels, and now I've talked half an hour about hydrogen. And so when we talk about hydrogen and synth fuels, there are two things we would need to discuss, and that is that we would make, of course, the synth fuels from hydrogen, partially, from hydrogen and carbon, or the idea of using hydrogen instead of hydrocarbon fuels.
Right.
So I think what we need to discuss about this is that hydrogen is an extremely volatile molecule. Storing and transporting it is hard. Liquefying it, turning it into liquid hydrogen into a cryogenic fuel, which has been a staple of rocketry for the last 5 decades, but many now hope to do, like we are doing it with liquefied methane, with LNG, is incredibly energy intensive. And it boils off. This is the reason why the space industry avoids hydrogen for its upper stages, which is where efficiency matters the most. Hydrogen engines are more efficient in rockets than other engines. But the problem is that hydrogen boils off in the tanks. So the longer the stage of a rocket is on the mission, the more hydrogen would boil off. So for rocket stages, which are in flight for a long time, hydrogen is generally not used because it would drain too much of your tank for just nothing. So this is also the main reason why, for example, SpaceX has completely abandoned hydrogen for their Starship to go to Mars. By the time you would arrive at Mars, 30% of the fuel in your tanks that you need to do the burn to enter the Martian atmosphere and then slow down will be gone. And this isn't the case with methane. You will have some boil off with liquid methane, but it will be barely anything compared to hydrogen. So this is a huge issue, the boil off and the energy to liquefy it. Liquefying methane will take you 10% of the energy that is stored in the methane. Liquefying hydrogen will take you 38% of the energy that is stored in the hydrogen. Also, compressing the hydrogen could be a possibility, but hydrogen, even liquefied or compressed, has incredibly terrible energy then. Compare that to petrol or
sure, unlike any of the others, yeah.
Significantly, several times lower than those. But you still need to compress a lot of volume of gas to at an extremely high temperature pressure, which will need a lot of energy. So even if you use compressed hydrogen, you will still be talking about 10 to 20% of the energy stored in the hydrogen being put into the compression process. So using hydrogen directly as a fuel is energy inefficient in itself. And I think another problem that we have with hydrogen, and that especially environmentally minded folks can't stop talking about, is the methane leakage.
Right, yeah, as we were saying.
Surprise, surprise, hydrogen leaks as well, and hydrogen also significantly worsens global warming. It isn't a greenhouse gas in itself, but it extends the life of greenhouse gases like methane on nitrogen oxide. So
Okay.
it will not in itself cause more global warming, but it will lengthen the time into which those other greenhouse gases will be active in the atmosphere, and thus larger amounts of those gases can accumulate. And
gotcha.
So hydrogen is not climate neutral, so to say. So and it is extremely inefficient. This is what, especially compared to the idea of making a synthetic fuel, synthetic hydrocarbon, which people object because you would lose some of the energy stored in the hydrogen in making the hydrocarbons. And there are fears of it not being entirely net negative in greenhouse gas emissions. Well, hydrogen isn't, because we will always have leakage. And you will probably even see even worse losses of energy in the energy when compressing or liquefying the hydrogen compared to turning the hydrogen into a hydrocarbon. And the hydrocarbon can be stored much better, can be used and burned more efficiently, and would require less retooling of our energy infrastructure. So all the supposed benefits for which people want to use hydrogen as a replacement for petrol or diesel or kerosene, I think aren't really valid. In any sense, I think hydrogen is worse than making synthetic hydrocarbons.
Right. Just an inferior alternative. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
And especially the leakage issue. I mean,
you
would make hydrogen
tiny
for the
particles.
Of course, you would make the hydrogen for the synthetic fuels as well. However, you would make it in situ and produce it just in time, especially with nuclear, where you don't have to flatten out production heights, but just have flat production all the time, which you then turn into flat production of synthetic hydrocarbons. The hydrogen is made in situ and just in time. So it will barely be transported and will barely be stored. So barely anything will leak. Compare that to the idea of putting it on thousands of ships, into tens of thousands of pipelines, into tens of millions of tanks from cars to tractors to airplanes.
Right.
You will give the hydrogen so many cases where it can leak that, yes, some hydrogen will leak in the process of making synthetic hydrocarbons, but we will be talking about orders of magnitude less, so little that it won't really be a problem compared to the hydrogen, which will become a greenhouse gas problem as soon as we will start using a significant amount of it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. Like, it's hard to get people to keep it realistic. I think everybody wants their magic bullet. Everybody, like you said, the iconoclasm. Everybody wants their flashy, fancy thing. But at the end of the day, we're talking about real stuff that needs to work reliably and affordably in the everyday world.
It's similar with, I think, with nuclear reactors as well. where people see molten salt or TRISO reactors, because I think it's easier and more convenient, especially for one's own mind, to blame the shortcomings of nuclear on the evilness of the light water reactors, rather than admitting that the nuclear energy sector made mistakes and that our political class made even worse mistakes.
Yes.
Which is extremely sad, because the light water reactor, unlike what, and also the heavy water reactor, unlike what so many nuke bros will tell you, isn't an expensive or unsafe design.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I would make the case that it is the most really and safe design out there, and it will remain that way for a long time, potentially forever.
Well, that reminds me, when we're done with our synth fuel series, because we'll likely have a few more episodes to do on this together, we should do a nuclear reactor series.
That could be 20 episodes we're talking.
We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. But for now, I want to thank you for coming on. I learned a ton from this. People, I hope you learned a ton from this. And we're going to keep doing it because everybody needs a little more fluency and a little more visibility and what's actually going on with energy in our world, especially as things get weirder and more difficult. So, Noah, thanks for coming on. People who want to reach out to Noah,
Thank you for having me.
yeah, and follow him and learn more from him. His Twitter will be in the show notes. But for now, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. And we will see you next time.
Goodbye.